these slides have got a lot of writing on them, and the reason is that I'm not really meant to tinker with our WHO slides, so I apologise, they're not very fun to read, but we'll just slip through and I'll just highlight bits and pieces in them, but you've got the handouts for the rest of it. So I'm a member of a group called SAGE, which is a strategic advisory group of experts of immunisation. This was established in 1999. It's the advisory group to the World Health Organization for all issues to do with vaccines and vaccine provision and strategic issues around both the vaccines themselves and the service delivery. It's comprised of about 15 people, and it's made up of 2 or 3 members of each of the regions of the world. So which region are we in, folks? Western Pacific region, which includes Australia, yeah. So we're in the Western Pacific. There's myself and an Australian guy on it. I replaced a Chinese person. The weirdest feeling when you sit and talk about New Zealand and we talk about our population number, and I've just spoken after a Chinese guy. You know, it's like just unbelievable, the numbers in China. So anyway, we're the Western Pacific region. And so they meet twice a year. And it gets even, if you thought we were complicated, the world is just a nightmare. So there's a whole lot of other groups, but essentially SAGE is an advisory committee to the World Health Organization, and then there are regional technical advisory groups. So I tend to go to the regional technical advisory meeting, where's the regional office? In Manila, yeah. So I tend to go to the Manila meeting, which is once a year. And then there are national immunisation technical advisory groups, which the WHO recommends every country to have. Now, New Zealand's a little unusual in having the Ministry of Health and PHARMAC. So we have a technical advisory group, which is partially the subgroup to PHARMAC and partially support to the ministry, and it's a bit of an overlap. But that's the way they're all divided up. These are the 6 WHO regions. That's how it works. Whoops, let's carry on. Now, SAGE is there to make recommendations. It's really particularly to help low and middle income countries and countries that don't have enough resources themselves. But on the whole now, more and more, the SAGE is trying to set advice for the world around issues. So that's where we're up to. And these are some of the issues that have been covered, like pandemic flus, HPV vaccine, a lot about polio, and all sorts of other things. So I just listed there so you know that people go through a grade system when we make decisions in SAGE. So it's meant to be a strong academic base, as much as you can do with a lot of stuff where you've got deliberations between policy and vaccines, okay? So this is sort of how they rate the quality of evidence. So I just chucked that in there. So some of the global issues that I just wanted to highlight is that the world's not done too bad. We're getting about 90% coverage with the first dose of Pertussis containing vaccines, but down to about 86% by the 3rd dose. So I mean, I don't know, you could either say that's good or you could say it's bad, but the problem is it hasn't improved over the last few years. And there's particular countries and parts of the world where it's terrible. And then within countries you might have high coverage, but you've got groups with really low coverage. Some of the newer vaccines are coming in but still have very low coverage. Issues around the Western Pacific, our region actually does really well. We're actually pretty high on coverage on the whole, but we have still a lot of problem with measles, and we've had some really large outbreaks of measles in our part of the world. There's a few large countries that don't perform well that you guys can guess who they are. Countries such as India and Pakistan, they have really big numbers of kids, and of course many African countries really struggle, and war zones now are becoming a bigger and bigger issue. So this was the latest global advice about trying to close the gaps, is trying to integrate, trying to strengthen health systems. And one of the problems is we're sort of too vertical, and we do really well saying, here's the vaccine, here's how we're going to deliver it, and we can do really well. But if we don't integrate effectively with the systems of the country, then I think you lose a lot of the gain. And one of the advantages of me being there is I've actually been able to sell the New Zealand story about how we've integrated vaccines into service delivery and how it's made such a difference and how it's really helped things like vaccine hesitancy rather than just having a straight vertical program where the ministry says we're going to do this. That doesn't work because they don't support the service provider at the bottom and the provider-kid interaction. So there's a lot to be learnt from just strengthening health services. And of course the problem of accessibility and affordability. If anyone's ever heard Papua New Guinea talk about how you get vaccines into some of those places in Papua New Guinea, and you have to take them over mountains, across rivers, and whatever happens there, it's the most extraordinary place. I don't know how they get vaccines to people. So this is just some WHO stuff that I'll move on from, and the importance of national technical advisory groups. And that's their vision. I just chucked that in there because the World Health Organization, just to show you that like everybody else, they write visions about what they're doing. But they're trying to sort of convene experts and leaders to establish some norms, to get some global norms, to make them as evidence-based as possible, and to bring the synergies together so you learn from one for another. So you can learn from Ebola, so you can learn about Zika and things like that, rather than everything being in isolation, and then try and monitor and feedback. So the latest global report is that the Sustainable Development Goals do not have an immunisation one. And so we're agitating to try and get an immunisation specific one into them. And that's what we're arguing for at the moment, okay? There's a huge amount of humanitarian crises problems, as you can imagine, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean region. Okay, so there's a real challenge around getting vaccines to kids. It's amazing what people do out there. And there's a big outbreak at the moment of yellow fever in many countries. We ran out of yellow fever vaccine. So we're actually going for intradermal, smaller doses, because we've run out of vaccine. So yellow fever is quite a problem. In our area, we've got 8 goals for a regional framework, okay? It's quite interesting in the Western Pacific because a lot of the Asian countries are all private. So, you know, there's quite a lot of different models out there about how it's doing. On the whole, we're doing fine, except for measles, still going round and round in circles, okay? And we've done really well on the whole with polio. There's no polio in the region, okay? So just some general issues. There's a research and development blueprint that's looking at things like Zika virus. So, you know, we're well underway to develop Ebola viruses. They're now looking really fast at Zika virus development. They want to use the Ebola vaccine experience for future because that was fast-tracked. You know, the ethics applications, the process, the trials were the fastest you've ever seen. They essentially got a vaccine through in about 9 months, which is unheard of. It used to be 10 to 15 years. So they want to learn with the Ebola experience to help fast-track things like Zika, okay? And it's just commenting on Ebola. And I'll talk about malaria later because there's a malaria vaccine that has limited use and is quite problematic. The other cool thing is vaccine administration. I'm begging for this one. No more needles, you know. So they're doing a lot of work to try and get rid of needles. And so this will microarray array patches, which are little square patches you just put on your skin and just go subdermis. So I'm just going to touch on a few of these. Make any comments along the way if you like. I'm just going to zoom through a few of these issues because you guys are going to get inflicted with the things that I find the most interesting. So it's what you get for the end of the day, okay? Varicella and herpes zoster. So we've talked about varicella today anyway. So basically, WHO recommends countries should be using varicella vaccines, administering anywhere between 12 and 18 months, okay? And to remember high risk groups. So that's backing up the New Zealand strategy, which is really nice. HPV we've already covered. That WHO recommends a 2-dose regime for kids under 15. So it's taken us a little while to get there, but it's great that we can follow that. Pertussis vaccine. Now this is really interesting. So we've been using acellular pertussis vaccines now for quite a while, and we moved to acellular because the wholesale, you guys will remember, it's got much more side effects, particularly for us slightly more mature years in the group. You know, you get much more sore arms, high fevers, HHEs, you know, acellular is much nicer. It's probably slightly less effective. So there's quite a world discussion going on about whether countries that are currently using wholesale should move to acellular. And essentially the decision has been not yet, stick to wholesale because it's probably slightly more effective, okay? And the other big discussion going on is the use of maternal vaccination with acellular. So New Zealand actually was relatively quick off the mark here, and I think we've done really well. We're one of the earlier countries in the world to start using maternal. A lot of our conversations in SAGE have been around really ramping up the use of maternal vaccines and also doing clinical trials on pregnant women. So one of the problems was that people avoided doing clinical trials on pregnant women. So as a result of which pregnant women got left out because everyone was too scared to do a clinical trial. So you didn't have any clinical data, so you never used them. So there's been a real gap for a long time, and now we realise that maternal vaccination probably has significant gains. So hence we're doing, what are we doing in maternal vaccination? Flu and pertussis. Absolutely. So pertussis vaccination, Pertussis vaccination is the main driver behind the schedule. So when we decide about our infant schedule and our booster toddler doses, we're really driven by pertussis, because pertussis comes early, it's a huge burden of disease, and our vaccines, they're okay, but they're not like HPV, okay? So the vaccines are okay, but they're not brilliant. You don't really get much herd immunity at all, and you can get repeated disease. So really, pertussis is the problem child, and vaccine schedules are really set by pertussis at the moment. The emphasis is on the early start, so New Zealand's already there, but some countries start later. Currently, they're still recommending a 3-dose primary. Now, I had mentioned that quite a few of the European countries have moved to a 2+1. Okay, now that's still on the cards, and it works well for some countries. So this is really around developing and middle-income countries. If you have an AP schedule, you need a booster dose. We have a booster dose, we give it at 4. Okay. Now this is really cool. The Men A story is amazing. So the UK were the first off the market with meningococcal conjugate vaccines, and they had a problem with C. So they designed a C for the British market, and they dramatically reduced meningococcal C in the UK. It was fantastic. But unfortunately, it was the malaria belt of Africa that needed it much more than the UK. This is the inverse care law. So bless our colleagues in the UK, they should have designed a Men A vaccine if they were a bit more kind, but you know, hey, we wouldn't have done it either. So finally, after them, there was this amazing international consortium that got together by the skin of its teeth, borrowed stuff from all over the place, and designed meningococcal A conjugates. And they've delivered them to truckloads of people across the meningitis belt in Africa, and they have made dramatic reductions in meningococcal A across Africa. It's just an incredible story, because really, you know, no big international vaccine company was interested at all. Nobody gave a toss. And so this was a huge consortium of people who realised this was an enormous problem, and the story is one of the greatest stories I've ever heard. It's this huge reduction in meningococcal A, because of course conjugates are fantastic vaccines and you get great herd immunity from them. So there's a lot of discussion about Men A, and of course once they've done the one-off mass vaccination campaign, then we had to make a decision at the SAGE level about what we recommended next. So the recommended was a single dose schedule, because once you've done a mass campaign with conjugates and you've got herd immunity, you can maintain it with a single dose, which is very cool. So there's a whole lot of discussions around conjugates in general about once you've got herd immunity, can you just move to a single dose? So that was some of the stuff we came up with around Men A. Now these are the sort of things they publish, the weekly epidemiological review, which is still in English and French, which is fascinating, eh? Because the whole lot is all in English now. Sorry, Francophone countries, but all their meetings and everything's in English. Thank God for me, since I speak one language badly. But everything's still in French as well. It's really quite funny. Ebola vaccines, this was amazing. So the Ebola epidemic appeared, and once it hit America, everyone decided they needed a vaccine. Maybe I'm slightly cynical here, but essentially once Western countries get scared, things happen, let's be honest. That's the ruthless truth. And so Ebola vaccines were designed amazingly rapidly, within 6 to 9 months. But by the time we got to RCTs, phase 3 trials, the numbers were diving. Because really, this was about service delivery and hygiene, you know. So the numbers were diving by the time we got to phase 3 trials. So it was quite hard to show efficacy. So they've got good immunogenicity, like good evidence that these vaccines get good antibody response. But it's hard to show overall efficacy until you get another Ebola epidemic. But I think if and when another Ebola epidemic comes along, there are now very good vaccine candidates sitting there waiting to be used. So this was quite a fantastic example of international collaboration working quite well. Measles vaccine, okay, I told you HPV was great, but I was lying. Measles vaccine is the most amazing vaccine. And it's not just that it eradicates measles, and it's not just that I like vaccines, but if you give measles vaccine, you reduce all-cause mortality, not just measles. Now, we've known this for a long time in developing countries, that there are non-specific effects of measles vaccine. And the reasons for it probably are that if you do get measles, it seems to wipe out your repertoire of memory for other diseases. So after you have measles, you're then more vulnerable to heaps and heaps of other childhood diseases. So when you use measles vaccination, in developing countries, all-cause childhood mortality drops hugely, not just from measles. And interestingly, there's been recent modelling papers in Western countries that show the same effect on particularly morbidity, as you'd expect, rather than mortality. So stopping measles is also preventing what would have happened, which was a lot of other diseases following measles. So extraordinary vaccine. And other vaccines don't act like that. In fact, all-cause mortality in developing countries for some vaccines, particularly pertussis containing, probably increases. So there's something special about the measles vaccine. So we've got to love it. It's an amazing vaccine. Okay, so there's a whole lot of things about measles control. The world is still not getting anywhere near elimination because we're nowhere near 95% consistently without big gaps. The big 95% that people always throw about, that's about measles. Okay, it's always about measles elimination. So we're undertaking right now a midterm review, which we're going to present at SAGE in October. So the countries that are getting close to elimination are seeing a bimodal age distribution. This is exactly what New Zealand is seeing, where we see infants who are too young to be vaccinated, and we see adolescents and young adults who have missed out on their vaccination. That is exactly New Zealand's problem, that we used to be absolutely crappy at vaccinating, and so there's a heap of people walking around in the New Zealand community that did not get vaccination. So anybody born since the moon landing, 1969, probably all had wild measles. Okay, so you don't worry about people my age and older. You worry about everything else about us, but not measles. Okay, whereas people younger than that may well have missed out on vaccination and don't know it. So that's why there's all this pressure on us in primary care to give MMR to anything that moves and breathes. Pretty simple, really, eh? Vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. Look, if you're over-vaccinated, it's not unsafe, you know, because if somebody's already immune to measles and you give them the vaccine, they're going to deactivate a live vaccine straight away and they're not going to get any side effects. So no worries about over-vaccinating, all right? So no history, no records, just vaccinate. Take it out of the fridge, PHARMAC pays for it. Fully.
Yes.
It's a cheap vaccine.
Yeah, that's right.
No, but it is true. I mean, that's the strategy, is 2 MMRs for anyone with no history, okay? So I'm just giving you a hard time. Okay. We can use MMR in younger kids. You do get maternal antibody interference, but it still works. So when we do it in younger kids, you do it, as we know, where there's a higher risk of measles. So if you're worried that the kid might be in contact with measles or there's an outbreak, or you've just an area in general where people have got low coverage, you would vaccinate under a year of age, but we would call it MMR 0. And you still need 2 doses. Okay? I think that's about it on measles. The malaria vaccine, okay, this is really sad. So malaria is a huge worldwide problem. I don't know much about it, but it's an enormous problem. They have done reasonably well with control mechanisms, in particular impregnated bed nets make the most difference, but you are seeing more insecticide resistance. So malaria is a huge, huge problem, particularly in Africa. And so this is the first malaria vaccine cab off the rank. It's got the sexy name, RTS-AS01. It's actually called Mosquirix, which is easier. It's a GSK vaccine, yeah. So anyway, this vaccine's been, 20 years in the pipeline, and everybody is really waiting for it. They did large clinical trials in Africa to look at whether this vaccine worked or not, okay? So they've done a pivotal phase 3 trial on 15,000 infants and young kids. Now the problem it showed was that it is a little bit effective, basically. So it's moderately effective, but not great. And the bottom line problem is if you give the vaccine at the infant schedule ages for the EPI, which is 6, 12 and 18 weeks, that's what low-income countries give, you probably cause more malaria than you stop because you shift the epidemiology. So you might prevent the little kids having malaria, but as the vaccine effectiveness wanes, they'll get malaria when they're toddlers and they'll probably get it more severely. So you don't want to give the vaccine to little kids. Now, if you give it to infants starting from 5 months in a 3-dose regime with a booster in the 2nd year of life, it is effective. But if you don't give the booster in the 2nd year of life, you could cause more harm. So, would you license this vaccine in African countries who have incredibly weak service delivery? Well, kids are dying of malaria.
1 in 4, isn't it?
Yeah. You're exactly how we felt, okay? We sat for days going, what the hell do you make of this one, okay? This is a really hard decision. So this is the vaccine efficacy. I think this is an ethical dilemma, personally. This is the vaccine decision. So if you give the vaccine at 5 to 17 months, a 3-dose regime, it looks like you cause harm, okay? That's a negative result. But it may not cause harm, but it could. Whereas if you give a 4-dose regime, you're having maybe nearly up to a third of kids, you'll reduce nasty malaria. Whereas if you give it at 6 to 12 months, no effect at all, and maybe a negative effect. Really, really difficult decision. Yeah. The other thing that I found really hard personally, and I do like vaccines, but I found this really hard, that one of the clinical trial areas where they'd given the vaccine, they showed both in those who were vaccinated and the control groups who were given a different vaccine, all had reduced mortality. Why was that? Well, it wasn't a vaccine effect, because the control groups did too. And the reason was they did two things in this clinical trial. They gave the kids access to healthcare services. They got them to hospital when they were sick, and they gave the healthcare practitioners protocols for how to treat malaria. That's all they did, and they reduced all-cause mortality. Now, we're designing a friggin' expensive vaccine, huge cost, whereas actually, we should be... Oh no, doesn't it break your heart? So we made this point again and again and again, but really, that's what really hurt. So in the end, the decision was made that yes, if you delivered the vaccine well in a 3+1 dose after 5 months of age, it could possibly have up to a third effectiveness, but we weren't ready to say it should be rolled out. Now, I have to say SAGE was under a lot of pressure because the European agency had already licensed this vaccine. So the world wanted it. So you had a whole world saying, what is your problem? It's a vaccine that works, get on with it. So it was a very interesting experience. And in the end, SAGE made this decision that we're going to ask for staged pilot implementations, like well monitored, well evaluated follow through. Because there were also a couple of other concerns about excess cases of meningitis and cerebral malaria, which were unclear in the clinical trials. So that's where they're at the moment, and the Gavi Alliance with several countries are now funding some staged big pilots of this vaccine. Because the other problem is if you'd said absolutely no to the vaccine, apparently the pharmaceutical industry would have basically downed tools and not done anything more on malaria vaccines. This is 20 years development they've put into this vaccine. So the whole issue is quite tricky. Hard, eh?
So if you for totally unvaccinated children, they have millions die of malaria every year anyway, so does it actually make them more at risk of mortality if they have the 3 and then don't get it?
Your mortality is higher if you get it in the second year of life than in the first year of life. So if you shift the age you first get it to the second year of life, theoretically, it's not going to be better and it might be worse. So if you don't get the booster dose. So yeah. The other side is, will we still keep using bed nets? They work. People keep saying, oh, people don't like using bed nets. And I think, well, that's a bad excuse to just start using a vaccine just because you don't like bed nets and you're using them from wedding gowns, apparently. Apparently they're very nice for wedding dresses. Although, if they were insecticidal impregnated, I wonder what they smell like. Oh. Okay, polio. It's a tricky one, eh? So that was tricky. Polio is easier. Okay, we're really close to polio eradication, all right? There are 2 countries in the world that are hugely problematic, which are Afghanistan and Pakistan. Yeah, yes. 80 people have been killed in Pakistan so far trying to deliver polio vaccine. Did anyone hear the news today about a doctor's just been killed? Yesterday. Why? Does anyone know the story of Osama bin Laden? Oh, it breaks your heart. So the Americans were looking for Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, and they went out looking for him. And so they thought they'd try and find family members and genetically match them. So they wanted to get genetic materials. So they sent out a paediatrician who said he was doing a vaccination program, and he got oral swabs of kids door to door in Pakistan. The response has been, they found Osama bin Laden, but the response has been that in that area they lost complete confidence in the vaccination program. They see it as an American plot, and the vaccination program has never recovered ever since. And there's a part of Pakistan, Waziristan I think, which will not let anybody in to vaccinate. So all they can do at the moment is stand at the border and vaccinate the kids when they cross. And it's spilling into Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is remote, difficult to get to. So there's real problems there. We are close to eradicating polio except for Pakistan and Afghanistan. And recently, did anyone hear where polio is broken out? It's come back into Nigeria. There's 3 cases in northern Nigeria and quite remote. Now, Nigeria about 10 years ago lost confidence in the vaccination program. And this wasn't really the Americans' fault, but they decided it was an American plot to, they reckon there was contraceptives in the OPV. In northern Muslim countries, they decided it was an American plot to stop producing Muslim babies. So they lost confidence there about 10 years ago. The confidence is restored now through a lot of international effort, but you've still got the legacy in that country. So it's sort of interesting, how communication gets caught in the middle. So anyway, we are close to eradicating polio. We moved to using a bivalent oral polio in the whole world, all at the same time in April. It's the coolest thing, We just switched overnight. And the intention will be to eventually switch to full IPV, like New Zealand uses. Okay? So polio is cool. That's polio. All right, so polio is a good one, cool one, excellent one. Dengue, problematic. Another problematic one. So we've been trying to make a dengue vaccine, apparently, in the world for a long time. It's difficult, there's challenges with it. So there is a new dengue vaccine now available, okay? VacSIA, okay, which is the 4 related viruses in one vaccine. It's been licensed, particularly in Asia. Has anyone ever had dengue? We'll wait for New Zealand to warm up and see if we get it. So does the vaccine work? Well, yes, it does work, okay? So particularly for older people, the vaccine works. So the bottom line with the dengue vaccine is that it was meant to be used for primary protection in a 3-dose regime. And it was what they've discovered in the trials is that if you're already primed for dengue, it works really well. But if you're not already primed, it may make dengue worse. Apparently, I didn't know this, I'm learning so much stuff. Apparently the second dose of dengue is the worst. So that if you're not pre-primed, then it may be that you get a cluster effect, that your vaccine is like your first dose, and then when you get your second dose, you get it worse. So what they saw in the trials, and the trials were in dengue endemic countries, were that the older kids and the adults all got quite good effect from the vaccine, but the younger kids, there seemed to be a cluster effect where a year or 2 later they got worse dengue. Now, one could argue that they were going to get that anyway. So, but the problem is therefore that this vaccine now is recommended to be used from 9 years and up, and recommended to be used only in areas of high endemicity, not in areas where you're not already pre-primed. So we actually made no recommendations on travellers because it's quite tricky, but really if you wanted to think about it and you'd already had dengue, then the vaccine would be worth having. But if you haven't already had dengue, it's probably not worth having. That's my bottom line for all the science. And you're welcome to read all the science, which is convoluted and difficult. So that's dengue.
I mean, it feels like you broke all your bones, apparently.
Does it? Yeah, it's like bad flu, isn't it? Anyone had it?
Break bone fever, that's it.
Break bone fever. And it's a really big problem in the world, dengue. It's pretty well as big as malaria, so this is a big issue.
Well, you go up to Cairns in the tropics up there, they've got it, haven't they?
Yeah. So, what's that?
Bali.
Yeah.
On the islands.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's not recommended as a traveller's vaccine, but if you've had dengue before or you've got antibodies to dengue, it's probably really worth having.
Shane Jones has just had a case.
Has he?
Yeah.
Is he all right?
Well, he's recovering.
Knocks you around for ages, eh?
It'll be interesting to see what they do to our soldiers, because the army guys, if they get serology tested when they get back, and if they've had dengue, it's their choice as to whether they go back on deployment, because we know that it's going to be worse second time around. So
Well, see, I would offer those guys the vaccine.
guys all need to be vaccinated.
Yeah, I think that's an ideal, if you read the data carefully, they'd be the perfect ones to vaccinate. Right, so those are sort of some of the vaccine ones which I found really quite interesting. Just a few service delivery. There was a whole lot done around vaccine hesitancy, and some of you guys may have seen some of this work. So a lot of work around what we now international call vaccine hesitancy, which I think is quite a nice word for it. So these are people who delay an acceptance or refuse vaccine. It's obviously complex, it's context specific, there's a huge amount of factors, and so you might have heard of the 3 C's, complacency, convenience and confidence. And there's a whole matrix around it. So have you guys seen this picture? This is just to try and give a frame around vaccine hesitancy. So there's a lot of information around all the different aspects. I think this trust is huge. I've got a big thing about trust now, that if you trust your healthcare provider, you're about 80% of the way there. If you trust your government, you're even closer. It's interesting, we've done some qualitative research on varicella vaccine at 15 months, and all the parents have said, well, if it's on the national schedule, then the government obviously thinks it's worth having, therefore I'm going to have it. So despite what you hear around in the social media and the chatterings, most people, if the government recommends something, think, well, you know, the government's not that stupid. Let's do it, you know. Whereas, you know, the other way of looking at it is you've got the Donald Trump effect, where, you know, something like Donald Trump is saying, do not trust anybody except me, you know. And then I think you really are starting to break down trust in governments, you know. So I think the trust issue is enormous. The convenience issue we never do enough about. You know, one of the things around flu vaccine and occupational flu vaccine is that people don't get round to getting it, and they might be a little bit ambiguous and not think it's great, but really if the vaccines, you know, in general practice where we can just open the fridge and give it to ourselves, it's sort of easier than when you have to walk down the corridor and get it, you know. So I think convenience really does matter, making things as easy as possible and reducing all barriers. And then complacency, you know, I'm not going to get it, you know, I'm a hero, I don't get flu, you know. You know, so complacency is the other issue. I've got too many other competing lifestyle issues, you know. I mean, I know we put off our preventive health stuff all the time, you know, and I'm as guilty as anyone of delaying my smears, you know. I mean, let's be honest, but I never delay my haircuts. You know, what is the problem? Somebody agree with me. I never delay getting my haircut, and I have delayed my smear. There is a problem with human nature. Mea culpa. So anyway, if you want to read more about vaccine hesitancy, it's there. Multiple injections in a single visit. Now, interestingly, this has been an international focus, and one of the big reasons is because we're trying to get rid of the oral polio vaccine in the world. Why are we trying to get rid of oral polio vaccine? Because it's live and it can revert to polio. So the problem we're having around the world, and there's a problem in our region, Western Pacific and Laos, there was an outbreak of polio from the vaccine. So we want to get rid of oral polio through the world, which means an extra injection for kids. Now, some countries are only given one, and they think it's a nightmare to give two at once. Some countries are only giving two, and they think it's impossible to imagine giving three at once. And America used to not use combination vaccines, and they used to give 4 to 5 at once. So, you know, it's all about what you think. Travel vaccine. Anyone give travel vaccines and you give a whole load at once? There we go. There we go. You don't look like you're freaked out.
Oh no, I give it.
Yeah, I know, that's what I mean. You should be telling these countries that don't think they can give 2 vaccines at the same time, you know. Honestly, some of these countries are going, the parents will not accept 2. It's just not possible. They will not accept it. There's no way a parent would take 2 vaccines.
It's really difficult at the moment because you can't get out of cell polio and you can't get hepatitis.
Yeah.
So you just go, suck it up, guys.
Interesting, eh? So there we go. That was one. And we've talked about reducing pain and distress. So I had the privilege to chair this committee, which was really, really cool. Because one of the things is I think we've overlooked pain and distress, you know, and that really you can mitigate a lot. And a fair bit of vaccine hesitancy is just fear. And needles aren't natural, really. You know, they just aren't. So anything we can do to make people feel good about the event, you know, and feel like it was okay, you got through it, your kid was fine at the end of it. And you know that, in your waiting room, you're waiting and you're hearing the kid being given the 6th week, and then it goes quiet and you go, oh, well done, this is so cool, you know, and you go in and everybody's happy. And so, you know, you can really make a difference. So these are some of the big ones. You can imagine there were enormous cultural issues here. Like, you know, recommending breastfeeding. Seems like a no-brainer. Whoa, you know, recommending breastfeeding, well, what if they're in public? You know, it's like, oh my God. So we couldn't just lock, stock and barrel say breastfeed while you're vaccinating, because, you know, some people would not accept that culturally. Oh my goodness. So there are all sorts of funny little cultural things, but very interesting anyway. And this was the one that was sad. So I was also involved in chairing this one, which is around health system strengthening. I get involved in the tricky stuff. This one I don't think is going very far. And this is back to our point that if vaccines are too vertical and they're not integrated, we lose a lot. And so the world has been really good at introducing new vaccines and bloody lousy at strengthening in health systems. Really breaks your heart, because it's less romantic, you know. And so we had a session around trying to strengthen health systems, and I'm not sure we've got very far. And I do think this is a huge international problem. So we'll keep beating away at it, but I think it's very tricky. One of the things that we've really pushed is that improvement immunisation services should be a 3rd dimension of a vaccine program. So when you're looking at a new vaccine or your vaccination program, you're looking at safety and effectiveness, And alongside that, we should be looking at it within the context of the health services. And I think New Zealand does this pretty well. And I think we're probably leading the world, which is why we've done so well on closing the equity gap. It's pretty unusual in the world to have nearly closed an equity gap in primary care. It's almost never seen. So I think this is really important, and I think we're doing badly on it. Okay, huge world shortage of vaccines. Now, this doesn't hit us very much, but it might. The European countries are hugely short of the combination acellular vaccines. So the acellular pertussis vaccines in combination are in real shortage around European countries. We're lucky at the moment. We have had a significant shortage of BCG.
Why are these shortages happening?
Yeah, a whole lot of reasons. It's very complex.
Yeah, BCG's been a big issue.
Well, one reason is some vaccines are less romantic to make than others, and there's only a few international suppliers. There are countries producing their own, and we're not sure about their quality. And so some are more romantic than others. And others they just run out of, like varicella, there's just not enough international manufacturers for them. And others you've suddenly got a huge demand. So IPV, we suddenly want the whole world to have IPV. There were two main suppliers, and it's quite hard to make a vaccine. It's an unstable biological thing. And some of the earlier stuff fell over, so they're suddenly 6 months behind in the manufacture. A whole lot of complex reasons, and companies don't want to make more vaccines than they can sell, so they're not overproducing because they want to sell. So you can't push them to stock up. So if they fall over and something goes wrong, we don't have much leeway. So there's a whole lot of reasons, and it's a mess, and there's quite big international shortages out there. Philippines were ran out of pertussis containing vaccines for 9 months. It was terrible. Some of that was also about the country ability to get the vaccine into the country and to deliver it properly. So some of it's, and you know, some of it's about corruption in some countries. So it's a problem. Okay, so there's a real supply shortage issue. Missed opportunity to vaccinate, we all know about this, but you know that we should never ever forget that one of the biggest things is missed events, that you know kids are coming into healthcare services all the time and we miss the moment to vaccinate them. And this happens in every country consistently across the world. I mean, I actually did my master's on this a few years ago, and it just hasn't changed in any country. Missed opportunities to vaccinate are around about 32% of all kids. Really, really common for all of us. I miss it. They've walked out the door and I went, damn, I missed that vaccine. You know, I've been chasing people down the bloody road going, I missed that. You know? And sometimes it's a Friday afternoon, and let's be honest, not only am I going to the hairdresser, but I'm going, it's too hard. I have to confess. It does happen. So we know missed opportunities are a problem everywhere, and the WHO put some effort into it. Okay, so remember it. We know missed opportunities matter. About 60% are attributed to us, about 20% parents, and about 11% to healthcare services, and that would be about right. It's about us. But actually, I think this is probably not quite right, because if our practice management systems are in our face and reminding us properly, then we're better at it. If I've got something yelling at me from my screen, I'm less likely to forget it than if I haven't. So I actually think this works with this together, and I think we've done well on it, and we've had some conversations today about how we can do better on it. That's missed opportunities. Second year of life, this is just out of interest. We have a second year of life platform, but many countries don't. So one of the big discussions around that malaria vaccine, they don't even have a visit in the second year of life. So many countries have yet to have the booster. So there's a lot of conversation about getting a second year of life platform in. Oh, and I think we're nearly out of time. Vaccine Safety Committee. So these are all the subcommittees. So the Vaccine Safety Committee looks at a whole range of things around safety monitoring. The one I just brought to your attention was the one about HPV vaccines, okay? I think this is a really nice summary from SAGE. There's no concerns about the safety, there's concerns about the communication. Now, I just wanted to say that this thing that I've circulated to you guys actually, we're not circulating electronically because it's actually not meant to be distributed, okay? So don't photocopy it and distribute it widely, it's just for your own usage, okay? So you're allowed to use it for your own usage, but we can't circulate it more widely. But it's just for your support. And SAGE is interested in anxiety-related clusters. Okay, these are our fainters, and this is what counties learnt this year. And I'm really hoping that counties, we're going to support them and try and write up that experience, because you know they're the most experienced public health nurses in the country, and they hit problems with this. So I think we can learn a lot from these anxiety-related clusters. Okay, so those are the main things from there. I think that's about that, except new products coming along. The RSV vaccine is really exciting. There's quite a few, not just one, and they're maternal, vaccination subunit, and then their live attenuated infancy vaccinations. I think the RSV are going to be the next biggies, okay? Bronchiolitis, eradicating bronchiolitis, here we come. Okay. So there is a trial going on in one of them in counties at the moment. I reckon it'll be a few years away we're going to see RSV vaccines. I think they're doing some in Canterbury too. So the South Auckland and Canterbury are the same trial. So vaccinating pregnant women, vaccinating kids, okay? So RSV is the exciting one, and there's all these others. I think it's about, RSV, there we go. I put some things on RSV, and I think we're nearly there. Oh yeah, microneedles, okay? Here we come. If you're sick of fridges and you're sick of needles, that's what I'm dreaming of. And that's what we're heading towards. I think that's it.